Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today's video is inspired by a question that I got from Aoife at Pretty Purple Polka Dots. She basically came to our little Wilsathon group chat and was asking for recommendations of history, podcasts and YouTube channels. Anything that would be really good for people who are wanting to get into history but don't really know where to start. And of course I was just like,
did someone call me?
Because of course, as you probably know, I'm a big fan of history, but not only that, but I actually wrote one of my master's essays on the idea of history YouTube and history podcasts and why they are so great and should be acknowledged more by historians. I then proceeded to post like very lengthy recommendations for all of my favourite YouTubers and podcasters with detailed descriptions of why I like them and why they're a good shout, to the point that my group chat probably wanted to kick me out. But it did remind me that I had always wanted to make a video on this very topic, and since I'd basically planned out the entire video by accident, I thought might as well do it now. And this video is also a bit of a request for any of your recommendations. I know especially when it comes to specific types of history, podcasts that deal with specific periods of history, you know, I tend to gravitate towards the same kind of areas. So I would love to hear any recommendations you have for history podcasts. But firstly, starting off with YouTubers. Honestly, the first port of call that I would recommend that you go to if you are wanting to get into history is the Crash Course series, particularly Crash Course World History 1 and 2 and Crash Course European History. Hosted by John Green, Crash Course World History Part 1 goes chronologically from the agricultural revolution, so around about 10,000 BC, all the way through to the modern day. And I feel like a lot of people like the chronological approach to history. A lot of the time when people are trying to get into history on their own time, they're wanting to kind of plug in any gaps of knowledge that they didn't get from school. So this is like a really quick, easy way of being able to do that. The Crash Course World History Part 2 goes more in terms of themes than in chronology, thinking about prominent themes of history like war and money and disease, and the changes and continuities between those topics over time. And then Crash Course European History, just what it says on the tin, it is much more of a focus on European history from the late medieval period to now. This series I think was originally pitched as something to go along with the AP World History course that a lot of US teenagers take. However, the humour in it, the way that it's presented, isn't just limited to a teenage audience. I watched it for the first time as an adult and I really enjoyed it. Next up for YouTube is Biographics. This video series is hosted by Simon Whistler and it takes influential people from history and creates like 15 to 20-minute video biographies of them, taking you through a whistle-stop tour of their life. And it's all sorts of different influential people. You've got Augustus, you've got Neil Armstrong, Joan of Arc, Hitler, so many different kinds of people. Recently, Biographics have started doing a different series on their channel, which is focused on different pandemics through history, and you're just like, I wonder where they got the inspiration for that from. And this series includes pandemics like the AIDS crisis, the Spanish influenza, the Black Death. If you've ever wanted to get a little bit of an introduction to any of those pandemics through history, then these are really great informative videos. The third YouTube recommendation that I want to give you is Reading the Past, because I love Dr. Cat. I would say that this channel is most similar to BookTube in its style. There's no big production, there's no team behind the scenes writing the scripts. You've just got this very smart, very knowledgeable lady chatting about history in a really informative, easy to understand way. Dr. Cat tends to focus mostly on early modern history, so particularly the period between 1500 and 1800, and within that she's very much focused on the Tudor period, which is always a big win for me. But she isn't limited to that period, she does tackle other times as well. And she's also very recently introduced a series on her channel called History News, where she takes the month prior and goes through like the big stories within the historical community. My fourth YouTube recommendation is Oversimplified. Animated history, woo! So yeah, this is another whistle-stop tour focused history channel, but where the history is told through funny animation. And I have a lot of time for that. Now, like the name suggests, it is oversimplified. It is a very like simple, stripped down kind of history. It's not going to give you the most nuanced and sometimes even the most accurate descriptions of history, but it is a really good starting off point if you're wanting to learn about different historical periods and you want to make it fun for yourself. And then my last YouTube recommendation that I'm going to give you is Useful Charts. This is actually one that my friend India turned me on to. The main premise behind this YouTube channel is that it takes a historic family and basically charts their family tree, going down through the different generations so that you can make links between these different people. It's not at all limited to just family trees. There's also recently been a video on the presidential line of succession, different timeline videos. Now, I'll be honest, it's not my personal favourite because I much prefer learning about different people's lives and their personalities, like their interests, their emotions. That's more what I'm geared towards. But it is a really, really good reference point. And I think if you do have the kind of brain that really likes learning saying about like names and dates and facts and figures. If you like timelines, if you like charts, I know that there are people out there who that is what history is to them, then this is a really good one for you. So that's it for my history YouTubers. And like I say, I am always up to getting recommendations. And now into the history podcast, which is my real bread and butter. This is what I love. I'm going to start off with some more general history podcasts where they jump around and talk about different topics rather than having one specific focus. Firstly, my biggest recommendation is You're Dead to Me. This is hosted by my public history fave Greg Jenner, who you might also recognise as the author of Dead Famous. It is basically Greg Jenner, a historian and a comedian all get together and they talk about a particular time period, a different event, a person of history, and it's just really good fun. And because you've got this combination of different personalities and different skill sets, it's a really good, informative, accessible way into history, which also makes it really fun and really full of personality. It's one that even my friends who are not particularly into history really, really love. So I definitely think does work as a way into history. Alongside that, I would also recommend Homeschool History. This is also hosted by Greg Jenner, but it's much shorter episodes and they are much more tailored towards children. As you can imagine, it was originally created for the homeschooling purposes during COVID. But I think if you are just wanting like quick, funny, informative podcasts, then it's a really good one to go to, just to kind of whet your appetite and see what you're interested in. Next up is Stuff You Missed in History Class. This is actually a spin-off show from the podcast Stuff You Should Know, which is also a podcast that I really like. And once again, it does what it says on the tin. It kind of focuses on people and events that you aren't always taught about in history classes at school or by the media, talking about the people and the events that are often neglected in traditional popular culture. The next three recommendations that I want to give you are all kind of similar, and those are History Extra podcast, which is produced by BBC History Magazine, Dan Snow's History Hit, and the Historic Royal Palaces podcast. All three of these podcasts I really, really enjoy, and they kind of bat between different time periods. However, I've kind of grouped them together because I feel like I have much of the same things to say about them. They talk about a real variety of topics and time periods. All three of them mainly speak to historians. However, I think they do try and keep it really accessible. Even though all three of these podcasts tend to be historians or history enthusiasts talking together, they do always take the time to kind of step back and explain things for people in the audience who are maybe coming to this fresh, and I think that's always really a good sign. And I think the good thing about all three of these podcasts is that you're getting a chance to listen to academic historians talk and really talking about historiography and the process of writing and making history, making it so it's not this inaccessible like tower in the sky, this big elite thing that you can never touch. It really breaks down the ways in which history is recorded, and I think that's always a welcome thing because history is not scary. I kind of said that in a bit of a tone. History isn't scary, but it's not. It's really good fun. It's not this elusive thing that is set in stone and that other people can't understand because it's made by people. And I feel like I often think about these in terms of how they stand in contrast to something like In Our Time, which is the very popular BBC Three radio show, which I do really, really like. However, I would never recommend this as a place to start off. In Our Time is a really great show. They cover so many different topics, not just history, but also like science and philosophy, religion. And they also have academics on, but it is very academic and it has absolutely no interest in kind of simplifying things down, in like kind of taking a back step and saying, hey, not everybody in this audience is maybe going to know about this. Let's kind of break it down and explain it in a way that everybody can understand. It's a show that really has no interest in doing that. It is basically like a lot of academics kind of showboating, and I feel like that can be really jarring and really off-putting if you are somebody who's trying to get into history and you are feeling like, oh my god, there is so much that I don't understand. You don't need academics showboating and making you feel like you know nothing. One thing I will say about In Our Time though is that a lot of the time the historians that they get on the show disagree with each other, and it's so great. I'm definitely that really petty person who's kind of in the corner just watching them disagree, like, get her Jade. When academics disagree, oh, so much drama. I love it. Okay, now I want to talk about history podcasts that deal with more specific periods of history that are a little bit more contained in their focus. Okay, so as I've said in the past, I'm a big Tudor fan, and I actually feel like one of the podcasts that really sparked my interest in the Tudors was Tudor, I Hardly Know Her. I feel like that's one of those podcast names that lands a lot more if it's said in an American accent. Tudor, I Hardly Know Her, as opposed to Tudor, I Hardly Know Her. But this podcast is brilliant and it's so funny. The premise of this is basically a Tudor fangirl educates her boyfriend and their friend on the Tudors. We start off talking about specific people, so we do Henry VIII, we then do his 6 wives, we then move into Edward, Mary and Elizabeth, and then from there it kind of branches off and talks about lots of different things to do with the Tudor period. Every single episode has some sort of punny title, which I really enjoy. And yeah, it's just funny and it doesn't take itself too seriously, and it kind of acknowledges like this is not a big academic podcast, this is definitely like amateur historians just enthusing about the Tudor period. But I think that's what's so great about it. I like hearing enthusiastic people talking talking about the things that they love, even if they aren't experts. I want to see people being enthusiastic and passionate, as opposed to something like Tudor's Dynasty, which is a really, really great Tudor podcast, but I would say listen to it after you've done Tudor I Hardly Know Her. Because yes, it is a Tudor podcast and I do love it, but it is very academic in tone, and it does kind of assume that you know a lot about Tudor history. It's a really great podcast and I really like listening to it and hearing the host talking about the different things that she's interested in, but I wouldn't recommend it as a first place to start. Another recommendation that I have is That's Ancient History, and yes, I'm mainly recommending this because it's done by BookTube's very own Jean from Jean's Bookish Thoughts, and also because it's about ancient history, and ancient history is so fun. And also this is a bit of a call out that I want more ancient history recommendations because I don't listen to enough podcasts that are just about ancient history. One that I've started listening to recently is The Rex Factor, which is one which goes through the different monarchs of England. Definitely one that I've been listening to a lot more since I've decided to do my Penguin Monarch series. This particular podcast has been a great help in like scripting out my videos, kind of plugging in gaps where I might have missed something from the book. Big recommendation. And then my last recommendation on this more like specific history train is once again another recent one that I've started listening to, which is the History Film Club. This is hosted by another one of my favourite public historians, Hannah Gregg, as well as Alex von Tunzelman. And each episode they get a different guest in and they talk about the process of adapting history into TV and film. And I love this podcast so much. Both of the hosts of this show have like vast amount of experience working in film and TV as historical advisors. And I feel like especially after this past year with things like The Crown and Bridgerton, which really sparked a lot of conversation about TV and film and historical accuracy. And oh, they've changed things. What about historical accuracy? You've basically got these two very smart historians being like, you don't think we've thought about that before we did this? You really think that like directors and scriptwriters just kind of sit there twiddling their thumbs thinking, oh, I don't know anything about history, let's just throw anything on screen and see what sticks? No, they get lots of very smart historians who are very knowledgeable about their periods to give them advice. But also that whatever they put on screen has also got to make narrative sense, and how there is a big balancing gap between presenting an accurate history but also doing something that is narratively satisfying. That is something that you have to reconcile and that you have to come to terms with. It's not as simple as just pointing at something and being like, oh, that didn't happen, that wasn't there. Just because something is not 100% accurate does not mean that it is bad history or that it makes it a bad costume drama. And I just really love this podcast because they really chat through the nuances in this discussion. And then my last little section of podcast recommendations is all about women of history focused podcasts, because that is my sweet spot. That is my favorite thing, because women of history are awesome. My first recommendation being the History Checks. This was the very first kind of like women in history podcast that I listened to. Each episode focuses on a different historical woman, kind of like a podcast biography. You've got so many different women who are focused on, from Marie Antoinette to Harriet Tubman, Audrey Hepburn to Pocahontas. What I will say about this podcast is that the episodes do tend to run quite long. It's not uncommon for there to be multiple parts to each episode and for each individual part to be like 2 hours long. So by the end of it, you feel like you really have lived a life with this person, but they are really, really informative. Then one of my absolute favourites is Queen's Podcast. This is hosted by Kathy and Nathan, and basically they take a different queen through history, make a cocktail based on that person's life, and then they just talk about her. It's very, very reminiscent of things like Drunk History. It's very, very funny. It is not safe for work. It is quite a sweary podcast, so, you know, bear that in mind if you're listening alongside young children. Their catchphrase is "History is a bag of dicks," which kind of speaks to the ways in which history is often presented through a very much like great man narrative, and often the women are left out of history, but also kind of speaks to the ways in which women were treated horribly through history, particularly by men. It's just a great podcast. It's really funny. I like it a lot. And then my final podcast recommendation in this section is Queens of England. It's very reminiscent of Queen's Podcast, however it is focused entirely on the Queens of England, as the title suggests, and it's not drunk or sweary, which I feel like some people might say, oh, well, is it just boring then? No. You've basically got this like lovely, mild-mannered academic man talking you through like the biography of different Queens of England. I enjoy it a lot. And he did do like a 3-part episode on Anne Boleyn, which just made my heart sing. So yeah, that was basically my little rundown of the different history podcasts that I listen to and would recommend. I would love to get any recommendations from you. I know that there are a lot of different like specific periods of history that I am not as well versed in. So any suggestions that you have, just leave them down below. One that I have been considering listening to but haven't is the History of England podcast, because this is one that does an intensely deep dive chronological look at the history of England from 400 to present day. But here's the thing, when I say that this is a deep dive of history, I really mean it. The podcast at this point has been running for 10 years. It is 310 episodes deep. Like I say, they started in the year 400 and the podcast is currently only at the 1580s. Like, there is a long way to go. And I'm quite a completionist, and I feel like if I started this podcast, I would just want to keep going until I got to the end. And that's quite a time commitment for me, and I feel like I would be neglecting every other podcast that I listen to just to listen to this one. So I don't know, I'm tempted, but I feel like it's a lot. Like I say, do let me know any of your podcast recommendations. Let me know about any of the ones that I spoke about today. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.